Good evening, everyone. I'm really delighted to have this evening with two colleagues from the union who worked together 40 years ago and have this opportunity to get together with you tonight and share our experience and feelings about Local 2325 of the Ladies Garment Workers Union. But to get us started, I want to show a short video about the garment industry and the role of Chinatown in the garment industry back in the day.
Remember somewhere our union sewing, our wages going to feed the kids and run the house. We work hard, but who's complaining? Thanks to the ILG, we're paying our way. So always look for the union label. It says we're able to make it in the USA.
Look for the union label when you are buying a coat, dress, or blouse. Remember somewhere our union sewing, our wages going to feed the kids and run the house. We work hard, but who's complaining? Thanks to the ILG, we're paying our way. So always look for the union label. It says we're able to make it in the USA.
Well, the ILGWU, which is the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, was such a unique union and rooted in a tradition of social unionism, which looked at the lives, the neighborhoods, the languages, the cultures of the workers, as much as it looked at the problems in the workplace. And Jay Mazer was also a very unique leader of the ILGWU and was the lead negotiator and the leader of Local 2325 during the 1982 strike. The ILGWU, starting in 1950s, had a training institute which offered a one-year intensive training for union leaders. And Jay, at age 18, was a graduate of that institute and went to work for a short time in Locals 22 and 40. And then in 1964, he started a very illustrious career in Local 2325. He served as manager for 5 years, and then after the strike became the president of the International Union, which he served basically from 1986 to and then through a merger to 2001 when he retired. And so a lot of people have asked me, what was Jay like? And what was your relationship with Jay? And this is the source of a lot of stories, which we can tell another time, but I think the main point for me was that he was a very strong, a very determined leader, and he was deeply committed to building the power and the participation of diverse workers into the union. And he talks about the importance of building the workers' identity, their loyalty, and their participation in the union as key ingredients that he worked on very hard in Local 2325. So my colleague here, Katie, has done a very long interview with Jay in 2016 about how he remembers the 1982 strike. And we have a short clip to play for you now. Oh, no.
Like other workers, you want to educate your children. You want them to have the best possible future. You want a decent home. You want to enjoy your family.
好似其他工人一樣，你哋想教育你哋嘅兒女，使到佢哋有美好嘅將來。
Chinatown to do these things, you need and rightfully demand equality with other garment workers. You refuse to be treated differently, and you won't be.
Yeah, I remember very vividly that speech in Columbus Park as standing in that park and hearing this dynamic union leader talking. And I want to ask Moose, who actually had a lot of experience at that point working very closely with Jay Mazer, what his experience was, was he doing, and how did he look at the role of Jay Mazer?
So I think, thank you so much. And we'll play, I guess, Katie's clip of the tape interview with Jay later. But about Jay, first of all, Jay was, you could not miss Jay in a room or in a crowd. He was a highly formidable presence, and he was very colorful, and he was funny, could be more funny at some times and more colorful at some other times, but he was a workaholic. He worked every Saturday that I know of. And then he was always had the goal in mind as to what's the most important thing. And that was what was true about the 1982 strike. My memory of Jay as a leader, and he was obviously the producer and director of the 1982 strike and the rally, was actually quite strong, is that he focused on what was important for him to do as the leader, which actually meant mostly staying in his office. And he delegated the rest of us to do other things. And it taught me a lot just as a person about time management of a leader, that he decided what he wanted to do was put pressure on the jobbers to sign, to make the contractors compliant with the contract. And the rest of us were doing sort of other parts of what made that strike and rally success, which was liaisoning with community-based organizations, which was then sort of trying to see which contractor is signing individual agreements. That remained the task. He delegated that task and was very trusting of people that he delegated. He had a reasonably high standard of people that he hired, but once he hired them, he relied them and trusted on them a lot. So, the 1982 was a major sort of a lens into Jay as a leader, which I think proved to be very important in his own rise in the leadership of the union, and you could argue was responsible for him becoming the president.
And specifically, what were you doing in this?
So this was, for our audience, the importance of that that moment. It was kind of a legal challenge for the union and a political challenge. I mean, I saw them as very distinct things. The legal challenge was a very odd, idiosyncratic thing about the apparel industry. It's the only industry where you have sort of the strange relationship between jobbers who really actually own the garments and sell them to retailers, but don't produce them in the shop that we have here, and they give them to contractors. And the union would sign agreements both with jobbers and contractors. Here was normally you would first sign the job with the contract with the jobbers, and then contractors would typically just rubber stamp the agreement that jobbers would sign. So they sort of duplicated the working conditions. This was the first time that the Contractors Association declined to endorse the contract. That became the legal fight, or something that broke down in this delicate relationship between jobbers and contractors. So by trying to push contractors to endorse, they would not do it. And therefore, the way around that, since the collective bargaining had failed, was to sign individual agreements, which was sort of anathema. The reason we had collective bargaining this is because you had to otherwise sign agreements with 500 to 800 shops. This is the way out. So we therefore had to go and find individual contractors, sign with them. So that was the legal. The political challenge, which was probably why that strike became much more known, was that it was a nuanced political challenge at various. First, it was a sort of the test of the members, which people thought was their test between their union loyalty and their ethnic loyalty. And the employers were dependent that they will go with the ethnic identity. That was the first test. So for workers, the fact that they were showing solidarity with the union was important. Secondly, I think the Chinatown community was sort of looking at the union, which was in leadership role. Is it really representing these 20,000 people, or is this just all for naught? So in that regard, it was an important thing. And finally, we felt it was one of the few strikes in the apparel industry in decades.
Yes.
So this was sort of becoming
Since
one more
1958.
test about the relevance of strikes, not only in the apparel industry, but about the union movement in general. So that's why it was both legally and politically an important moment.
Right.
And my job was to basically try to do a liaison with community-based organizations so they would support the union.
Yeah. And as quite a young person who had just
It
come
was
from
just-
India, right?
I had not been here for many years. I'd just come from law school, and it was my first entry-level job. And to get exposed like that to a very exciting part of the union's history was particularly personally rewarding for me.
Yeah. Well, let's play the audio clip of Katie's oral interview with Jay Mazur from 2016.
There was no doubt that the survival of the local as an entity within the union was at stake. This was fundamentally, the bottom line was that this was a power play. All of their demands equaled no union. That the union was so weak that they could do whatever they wanted, when they wanted, without paying any benefits. And the workers understood it. You see, that's the interesting thing. I mean, I would say that in my life in the union, seeing those women, they went to the factory, they got together, and they all started to march to Columbus Park. And that's what they did. And so they came in, you couldn't see. They started coming in from all over. And then the place was packed. It was standing from the rooftops and standing from the windows. And then we started marching, and we had a dragon. Remember we had the dragon up front? We marched through Chinatown, and the press was there, the TVs were there, and so on and so forth. But the workers showed up, and they showed up because in the end, they understood what was in their best interest. They understood that this was a struggle between them and the employer, and had nothing to do with their common identity as Chinese. And they performed.
Well, Katie, you were working in the factory at that time and had worked for several years when I first met you. And you were right on the shop floor. So can you talk about your work in the factory and as an activist in the union and what you saw happening with the Chinese workers and how they mobilized?
Right. Well, at the time I had worked in a factory for 6 or 7 years. And so I had been around to quite a few factories and worked. Then I also lived in Chinatown, so when shopping, I couldn't run into people who were shopping for vegetables or so forth. And I listened to what people are saying, and they were pissed. The workers were really mad that their employers were asking for things like a wage cut, taking away 3 holidays, cutting out vacation pay, threatening their medical benefits and also their retirement benefits. And remember that the women were the union members, and most of their husbands worked in restaurants. And so the restaurants were non-union. So actually the women's medical benefits covered the whole family. And so this wasn't just about the workers and their pay in the factory. It was about the livelihood of the whole family. So they were really, really concerned. And honestly, when they heard that the employers wanted to do this, they just wanted the union to fight back and to strike. A lot of workers were saying, in my factory, they were saying, you should tell the union to strike. And the factory upstairs from us even went on a wildcat strike and all, went to the union headquarters and said, we're not going back to work until the employers sign the contract. So the workers are really, really
And
angry.
what were you doing, and how were the workers engaging in the union? What did they have you all doing?
So I was working at a factory called Kin Yip, and I was sewing. I sewed waistbands and zippers. I'd been elected as shop steward, and the factory was one of the larger factories in Chinatown. It had about 200 workers, and so I was the chief steward, and we had stewards in different parts of the factory as well. And so actually when I attended a union meeting, I would come back to the factory and report through the employer's PA system about what happened at the union meeting. And so we had a pretty tight factory, and the stewards all sort of got together and decided that we would bring the people from our departments out to the union. So I don't know if you remember, Moose, but we came to a meeting at the union, like quite a few dozen people. And the next day, everybody went out and passed out leaflets in support of the strike. So,
So there were 2 rallies, one on June 24th and one on July 15th in Columbus Park. And, Moose was on the stage because I see him in the We Are One video in a green shirt and a lot more hair.
Much younger.
40 years ago.
Yeah, and Katie, where were you, and what happened on that day, and what did you see when you went into the park?
Oh, so I was actually a worker in the factory at the time, but during the period of the strike, Moose and others asked me to come work at the union temporarily. And so the spot that they placed me in was the strike headquarters in Chinatown. And so together with my colleague Jeff Bauman, we ran the strike headquarters in Chinatown. And so we had workers coming in, painting banners and it was a sort of staging area for people who the union sent out to be on the bullhorn, announcing that there was going to be a rally, and so on. So yeah, so I co-managed that office.
Right. So what do you remember? Because
But I remember
was,
both those days were because it was too early for my schedule to show up anywhere.
Yes.
I remember both times I went with Ed Vargas, who is a very close friend of ours and a colleague who is no longer with us, ran both those rallies. He was in charge of both those rallies.
Yeah.
So I showed up there with Ed both times, and we were the only 2 people, or maybe 3.
Yeah.
And, you know, not being an organizer, it's the ultimate sort of fear of any union person. Will people show up or no?
Right.
Like there's no one there.
Yeah.
About half an hour before the park is full.
Yeah.
And you're just really anxious that no one, which I realized internally is the fear of every union leader.
Oh, yeah.
including you, that people
Well,
are going to show up.
absolutely. Yeah.
But Ed, who was an organizer, was absolutely sure, was telling me they will show up. I'm telling you they will show up. Because there was, like Katie said, there was a reasonably elaborate, and this is before cell phones, folks, this
Sure.
is even before fax.
Right.
This is elaborate plan of how this was done in the old school.
Right.
We actually had a little operation headquarters at the local. Like everyone who was leaving the office would tell us where they were going, so that you could you know, stay in touch with them. And we ran the headquarters down. So we went to the organizers had sent organizers to various shops in the first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
So actually workers did not come to the rally first. They all went to work. So the impression that there's not going to be any strike. But they all did. They signed up. They typically signed up and stayed there for about half an hour and then came to the rally. So the organizers in their plan knew as how this was going to get orchestrated, so they knew in clockwork terms as to how when people would show up. And one of the things which I'm sure Katie will testify to, the sort of the solidarity among workers, even in the shop. When first worker would leave, then everyone would leave.
Yeah.
People would follow.
Right.
And then pour slowly and slowly into the park.
Yeah.
And that's what happened in both those days.
Right.
Yeah, I think the momentum for attending the rally built, you know, over quite a few days. You know, by the time the night before the rally, I remember somebody at the union asked me if anybody was going to show up. And I said, what do you mean? They're all going to be there. Yeah. But, you know, I mean, it's, you know, sort of having your fingers on the pulse and kind of knowing that what people are talking about and how they're feeling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So people like Ed Vargas and Katie had their, you know, fingers on the pulse. People like
Right.
me were anxious for the people to show up or no.
Okay. I mean, I just remember when we went to so-called pull the shops out, you know, we would go from floor to floor, and they had an electric switch that could turn off all the machines.
Right.
So you turn off all the machines, somebody stood up, and everybody walked out.
Right.
So I think that seemed to be the thing that happened. But I want to ask Moose, because we were talking earlier, where did the slogan, "We are one," come from? Because that's become the unifying slogan for our commemoration this year.
Well, it's a very funny, odd story about it, because Union obviously had a reasonably old school communication system. You know, someone wrote a speech or a press release and all that. But something very strange happened that summer. There was a chap called Mike Kerper, who was the chief aide to Senator Moynihan, and he decided suddenly that he wanted to become a priest. And between his leaving Senator Moynihan's office and to attending the seminary, he shows up at my office one day for lunch. Just around I said, "What are you doing for this?" He said, "I'm just waiting," because I said, I knew this was brewing. And I knew that Mike was an incredibly effective speechwriter. He had been doing it for Moynihan, he had been doing it for labor leaders before that. He worked for Bide Rustin. So I said, "Would you like to work here for the summer?" So I walked into Jay's office and I said, "Jay, Mike Kerper is here. I think we need him for the summer." He wrote every single speech for the rally. Not only for Jay, but for many others who showed up. And I think We Are One was sort of, I think it was Jay's idea, but it came in the context that they giving ideas about what the speech would work as. And the slogan, "We Are One," just fit.
Yeah, yeah. Because I remember walking in the Labor Day parade a few years ago, and one of the retirees had her grandkids, and she's saying, "We are one, we are one." So it was definitely a slogan that caught on. So how about July 15th? That was the last rally, and then there was a march down Mott Street. I just remember how unbelievable it was. And in Chinatown, I think it was very astonishing because of the number of women. Because most of the women in Chinatown were, you know, in the more stereotypic mode, kind of supposed to stay at home or behind the scenes, and all the organizations in Chinatown were very paternalistic and male-dominated. But I don't know, I remember seeing that and just feeling like, wow, this is so amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't remember in the moment, you didn't know that this was a historic moment happening. That's the reason, but you didn't know that those pictures would become really will last for a long time. There was women marching, you know, poor paid government workers marching with caps on the local 26, which had never been seen in large number. There was a line reading the parade in the beginning. I don't know whether you remember that or no. It had all the elements of Chinese culture with the Union strong slogan behind it. It was, you know, the largest line dance. It was the largest march that had happened in Chinatown and probably has happened since. So just in that regard, it was just memorable.
Yeah.
And you've written about this, so.
Yeah, you know, I think it was really important to bust those stereotypes of women being submissive and meek and you know, not willing to fight. So this really did it. This really showed that the women were aware of what was at stake and that they would fight for themselves and stand up for themselves. And I think the women themselves were surprised at, you know, the power that they could gain from this collective action. But I think it surprised a lot of other people too. I know it surprised people in the union that, you know, the Chinese members would stand up, and it surprised the employers. I don't think that they would.
They never expected that.
And so they caved.
That's right.
Yeah.
So in the loyalty test, these are the big challenges, and they survived. And but you know, it also, I have to tell you this, because in the moment you'd never realize, as I said, how lasting this would be. This was a 3-week period of the summer, okay? But short-lived as it was, it changed many things about the union. I have to say, first of all, it did spawn number of careers. Our short-lived, including 2 of you. I mean, you became prominent Asian American leaders of labor leaders of this country, arguably from that strike. I think you could trace it directly. Jay Mazer became president of the union from that strike. Susan Cowell, who was borrowed from the International, actually was the first person to start doing data collection in an organized way at the local, then became a vice president of the union. You could say my career in immigration sort of started from that. So a lot of things happened.
And the women, you know, a lot of them ran for executive board, and
Mrs. Carr,
they became active in the union activities.
Mrs. Carr, Connie, Alice, they all became, you know, really effective leaders, confident in their own sense. And then the second point you made, I hadn't thought about this until you asked, about social unionism. I mean, the union always had a history of social unionism, which is sort of what made ILG. But that sort of brought social unionism into Chinatown, in my view. First of all, a daycare center started as a result of that. You had a lot to do with it, you could say, arguably, because now there was enthusiasm. We can actually do these things in the community. A big scholarship program started, which you forget, sort of, you had something to do with that. The immigration project started at the union.
And you had something to do with that.
You had something to do with that.
Well,
so all these
you hired me over a lunch meeting.
Exactly. I had both of you over radio stars. But you know, all of them were not just personalities. They were actually building blocks of elements of social unionism, which really made ILG distinct from many other unions.
Yeah, and also, so then it's just, besides social unionism, it also sort of like created new leaders. It developed folks, and opened up opportunities that otherwise may not have been there.
Right.
Yeah.
right.
The other thing that I think it did was validate the notion of member-driven organizing. In other words, there are some unions where backroom deals are cut and, the members are maybe a little bit involved, but not really involved. And I think this taught us that it was really, really important to involve the members in every aspect of union life.
And
so
the
May and I,
union-
we would take busloads of people to peace marches in Washington,
Yeah.
D.C.
Yeah.
Yes.
Remember that? You said
Yeah,
one day
yes.
we'll laugh at this
Yes, I
when
know.
we lost the buses.
That's right. Well, and pro-choice rallies, which now
Yeah.
is becoming
I mean,
an
it certainly
issue again.
lends,
Yeah.
political muscle
Yeah.
to unions' agenda.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
But also, I think the union dealt with other aspects, not just the bread and butter, the contract, but also different aspects of the workers' lives,
Yeah.
which was very important. So, and they translated everything into 3 languages in the newsletter and really respected the languages and cultures of their members in many ways. So it was, and also brought people together.
Right.
One thing about this space that we're in the Tenement Museum is, we have this rice cooker, which is typical of the shops. But-
typical of Chinese shops.
yeah, Chinese shops, that's right, yeah. But I remember some of the kids of the members talking about going to union picnics, which
Yeah.
had Chinese and Spanish-speaking, African-American, all kinds of members at the picnic. And these kids would go from group to group, basically to test their food. They bring things to trade.
That's right.
But it was a real learning experience
Well,
like that.
and an integration experience. Talking
Yeah.
about we being
Right.
a nation of immigrants, unions became one of the few places where integration would happen. How else would a Chinatown worker know about Hispanic cuisine?
No, absolutely.
And
yeah.
I think the point you made about you made, Katie, about how important was not just to workers but to their families. Just imagine, even
Yeah.
from the scholarship program that you ran,
Yeah.
what impressive group of people came out of these garment
Oh, yeah.
families.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the union gave that opportunity.
Gave
to
that
them.
opportunity,
Yeah.
even with a small scholarship program like that.
Yeah.
You saw that there was a small benefit which would go a long way, which is what you do when you have a certain amount of vision. And so just the leadership that has come, certainly in the Chinese American community,
Oh, yeah.
from the children of government members, is a story in itself.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It's pretty astonishing.
Right.
Judges and journalists, and I've
Yeah,
met a lot of.
I can tell you this. I made an appearance once before a federal district judge, who I won't name, went to a conference. And the government's he said, I have to tell you first that my mother was a member of this union. Should I recuse myself? Any problems with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So, what other memories or legacies do you have from that time? Because you both moved on from working in the ILG, you into a fairly established migration and immigration advocacy career, and Katie at UC Berkeley in the Labor Center.
Right. So a couple of things is, one, I think after this experience we became active in the broader labor movement, trying to bring together Asian Pacific Islander workers to form APALA, the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. And APALA recruited new organizers, had a focus on immigration policy, and has done a lot to bring Asian workers to the fore and give them voice in the labor movement. The other thing is that I became interested in linking garment workers in the United States with garment workers in other countries.
Right.
So after I left the union, I went to the UC Berkeley Labor Center and specialized in labor issues in the global economy. And one of the things that I did was to connect garment workers and other workers across borders. I established a center in China to do that. So at one point, I took some of the women from the '82 strike to China, and they had learned to do videotaping, and they actually taped interviews with workers who were striking in garment factories in China. And when we were doing the debriefing, I said, okay, you guys went through the '82 strike and you've now done this. You know, how would you sum up the whole experience? And you know what they said? They sort of like, they hemmed and hawed, and you know, they were thinking about it. And finally they came up with, "We are one." That's right.
3 words.
They used that slogan and extended it to their co-workers, essentially,
Global
across
organizers.
borders.
Yeah. That's great.
The power of words and power of simple words
Yeah.
was one of these other sort of benefits of that. You know, it's you know, it sort of became like the part of the union label song, as the ethos of the union. You burst into it. You know,
Yeah, it sticks in
wherever
your
you
head.
are.
Yeah.
And then Moose, your career in
Well, my
migration.
career, you know, I never, you know,
Well, and the ILG was
I never
the
thought
first.
I would become an immigration person. I know, the issue found me because the union, I was doing contracts initially. I was not doing any immigration work.
Oh, that's
The union
interesting. I
started
didn't know
having immigration problems. The shops were getting raided, our arbitrators' offices were getting raided, and no one could quite understand what was going on. This is before we knew that there was something called an unauthorized population, because in the union we did not ask those days, and never do still, whether are you here legally or not. Frankly, before 1986, even an employer was not allowed to ask your status. So no one knew whether we had unauthorized workers or not. Maybe Kathy knew, who brought all of us into, Kathy Andrade, who brought all of us into the immigration intersection with labor. Suddenly we started, people didn't know what was going on. So when we started investigating, we realized that some of our members were unauthorized. That's really became the union's modern history with immigration. It obviously had an old history because it was Jewish and Italian, but the modern history came from experience of the raids. So the union became the first union to challenge the constitutionality of raids, and then we got involved in politics. And since the union had a lot of say, whatever position the union took had an influence. And we were the first union, I'm proud to say, which asked for legalization of unauthorized.
Yeah, that's
It
true.
goes as one of Jay's major contributions.
That's
He was
right.
the first
Yeah.
major labor leader other than Wallace Warta, I think, and Kathy, who openly said we should ask for legalization. It was very unpopular at that time. And then because of that, the AFL-CIO got converted, and AFL support was very important for the 1986 law, which legalized 3 million people. And from that, we had lobbied that. Then we implemented that law, in which you played, but the most critical role.
We legalized a lot of members.
In which you played a huge role. And from that, it became, we were doing work was making us nationally prominent.
Yeah.
I mean, our relevance to policy came, I always thought, because my work was rooted in experience of members. I could go and testify in Congress on a policy issue, not just as a policy issue, but it came from what I had experienced with my own members. It came with a certain amount of conviction and conviction. And that, I think, made the most important combination.
See, I think the point you just raised is related in some ways to something that I learned organizing women for a daycare center, which was that sometimes bread and butter issues are not necessarily what is at the forefront for union members in terms of what they're worried about, what's on their hearts and minds. Rather, in some cases it's immigration, or in some cases it might be childcare. And so in order to be able to connect with the workers, the union has to take on the
those
issues that the workers that care
Exactly.
about.
Especially for an industry where you don't get paid that much.
Yeah.
So you're not going to be happy being a garment worker just because of your pay. All these other elements of your personal and social life is what makes the difference.
Yeah. And that's the sort of fundamental reason why social unionism is
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
successful.
they gave the ILG a lot of heart and soul, so
Yeah.
I miss that. I mean, and I was, I think we're all lucky to have grown up in that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if we can move to other questions, or we have a small audience here. If there are any questions.
But a formidable audience.
Yes, yes.
Small but mighty.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I have a question about where these Chinese immigrant women came from and how that influenced your organizing and outreach, and especially, did everybody speak the same language? I'm wondering if somebody wants to speak about that.
Yeah. I can say something about that. Until 1965, when immigration law was changed, there weren't a whole lot of women in Chinatown. And after 1965, family members were able to join family members here in New York. And so at the time, most of the people came from Hong Kong. Later on, they became, by 1982, more were coming from mainland China. Now, mainland China at the time was very poor and mostly rural. And so the women who were working in the factory in 1982 were, for the most part, from rural areas. They didn't speak much English. They
Some of them didn't read and write in Chinese either.
Yeah.
They were not.
Yeah. They weren't highly educated, and and they also weren't used. They had never been in a union before, and if they had, it was a government union that was quite different from American-style unions. And so the members came to this crisis with a whole different set of background and experiences and knowledge than a typical American would have. And so that's part of the reason why this is so remarkable too. Yeah, some of them may have gone through the Cultural Revolution and been involved with marches and such, but for them to stand up against Chinese employers and follow a union that most of them had just a very shaky concept of was pretty interesting and pretty remarkable.
Mm-hmm. But Chinese immigration also has really evolved a lot, and you had people like this from the rural areas of Guangdong, as well as scholars or other intellectuals who came from other places and other provinces. And today, of course, because since Tiananmen, a lot of the immigration from China is coming from a very different China than in those days.
Yeah.
And it's a different population. So in any immigrant group, you have to kind of look at the sending country as well as the receiving country and who the people were. But I think this is a very specific population that, we grew up with, and it's aging now, but they were really a family.
But the Chinese, it's an interesting question, but the Chinese migration has always been complicated in the U.S. context, and let's not forget that. One is that we had the first group of people we excluded from the country were Chinese in the 1982 Chinese Exclusion Act.
1882.
Sorry, 1882, so it was the 82, 92
100
rally.
years before 1980.
Exactly 100 years before the rally. So there were no new Chinese coming after they had built our Chinese. So that provided background. So which created a really strange case which we had to confront in the immigration project, is you could not, any new Chinese could not come. So people were in many times pretending that the only people they could bring actually were their family, your son. So they were pretending that someone in China was their son and bringing them here. And therefore, there was a lot of fraud in this, and everyone knew it. And then in the 1950s, the government established something called the confession program, that the Chinese could come forward and say, we know we made a fraudulent claim, forgive us. But it also did not come with any reward. Just because you came forward, you would not get a green card. So when the legalization program was announced, many of our Chinese members were quite skeptical. They did not want to come forward because of the history of the confession program. That was our that was good part of our China. And then we didn't have relations with mainland China, People's Republic, till 1980. We could not come. So therefore, as Katie's right, pre-1980, it was almost exclusively non-PRC. And then it became PRC, and you saw the Mandarin versus Cantonese phenomenon, rural versus urban phenomenon that played out. And therefore, to me, the relationship between the workers and the employers was therefore heavily based on that ethnic sort of relationship.
Family relations.
That's why the rice phenomenon was important. Oh, we'll cook rice together. That's part of the relationship.
Eat lunch together.
In the shop.
And we have a question from our virtual audience as well. Deborah is wondering, were the spouses supportive of the union strikes and discussions? If you could talk a little bit about that.
I think it was mixed, but predominantly, I think that the husbands really supported it. As we said earlier, their health care was covered by the union's health plan, and so they had a lot to lose themselves if the union didn't win this battle. I think, too, that there was a guy who called me on the phone once and said that, you better watch out for these women. If the fire singes the hair on their body, they'll turn into tigers. And this is like a Chinese saying. And, indeed, he was right. And he was actually quite proud of the fact that his wife would go on strike.
Really?
Yeah.
That's good, yeah.
I think also the fact that there were so many factories and women could go to work and make money that went into the family was a factor that would encourage the families to support the strike, which was fighting for, better livelihood for the women and the family.
Yeah, I'm not Chinese American, but just look at the fact that this was a collective action. That women did something together, which men had not done in Chinatown, was a very important signal about the power of women.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think, in Chinatown, definitely, there was a lot more respect for women after this.
Well, and it changed dynamics in the families.
Yeah.
Women didn't feel like they were under their husband's thumb so much. If, he, constantly gambled away his earnings, well, they would divorce. And we saw, there were cases of this. And so the women became empowered not just in a sort of social sense, but also in a very personal, family sense.
Yeah.
Thank you. And one more question. Thinking about the diversity of the union members overall, how were sort of union members of other backgrounds involved in this strike, if at all?
Well, they were there in the rallies, in both rallies in 1982, because the contract with the jobbers had already been settled, and they were waiting for this last holdout group to sign so that the union contract was resolved. So we had significant numbers of sample hands and other, workers who were there in solidarity. And our education director at that time, Kathy Andrade, who was this very dynamic Central American woman, she was there. She came down to Chinatown, and she was there with her members to support the strike. And
I mean, it's the time to reflect on Kathy also, because we reflected a little on Ed. You know, Kathy also passed away last summer, who all of us will know was one of the most formidable women labor leaders.
Force of nature.
And certainly among immigrants, one of the first really, truly effective foreign-born female leaders in this country. She could ask members to do anything. She could ask people to show up at any time to do anything. So when Kathy told you that you have to show solidarity with workers in Chinatown and show up at the rally in Columbus Park, people showed up.
Yeah, I mean, this was very unique and beautiful about the ILG was the, really ethnic solidarity. I mean, while there were always, differences and frictions, still.
And the executive board was very.
Yeah, they were pretty active.
Executive board was quite mixed. So our vice chair Celia, who I think was on the picture that you showed, she was vice chair. Meng Fong was chair. So it was a.
Well, I think it's important to give some context too. I mean, 2325 had maybe about 25,000 members, and 20,000 were in Chinatown. So, the majority of the membership in the local was Chinese, number one. Number two is that the ones who were balking against signing the contract were the Chinese employers, right? Not the white contractors, the Jewish Contractors Association. The Greater Blouse was not balking. It was a subset of it. I forget, they had a name for themselves. I forget. Anyway, so the Chinese contractors had a smaller operation, and they were the ones who didn't want to sign the contract. So therefore, if you see pictures of the rally, almost all the workers are Chinese, because those are the ones who were affected.
Exactly. So in Mega, when we talk about the political issue, there was also a struggle between different employers.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Employers. There was a lot of internal struggle in that, and that was unfortunately ethnically based.
Thank you. And we have another question about the union. Just Laura was noting how amazing it is that there were so many garment shops and so many seamstresses and such unity and trust in the union among the workers. And she's wondering, what role did rank and file leaders play in the shops that got that trust?
I think that the members signed up to join the union 30 days after working in a factory. I mean, that was the rule, and they had to do it, and they wanted to get the benefits. But a lot of them didn't really have much information about the union. Many came to union meetings, but a whole lot didn't. And so, kind of by the time the strike happened, there was a question about whether people would show up to the rallies or not, or, whether they would strike or not. And so I think that shows that the trust really, was doubtful at that point. But after the rallies and after the strikes, the trust was there. Absolutely. I mean, people really understood that the union was in their best interest and was there for them. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest
takeaway.
Yeah, takeaway.
It was the test of the trust.
The bridging of the gap.
In many ways.
And so...
but within the shops, they did have a tradition of having chair ladies. And so there were rank and file shop leaders in the shop that had been identified by the union staffers who went to the shops regularly, like the ones who were more respected by their coworkers, a little more outspoken or whatever. And so that is an important role that the rank and file members played in the union and in the shops, was having a respected chair lady at the workplace. It's the one that everybody would gravitate to if they had a question or their benefits weren't working or something like that, or even if they had problems with their kids and what should they do. So these workers within the shops really played an important role. And the union was very skillful at identifying them and engaging them into union activities. We also had a lot of social activities. You know, we had trips and we had parties and things that would bring the workers together.
Yeah, we had Unity House, which was
Yeah.
another uniquely ILG phenomenon, and you can tell them what Unity House was.
You can tell.
No, I mean, it's like one of the few unions which owned a resort.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Well,
so
I
for-
mean, it
for-
started as a sanitarium for workers who had tuberculosis.
Yeah, but it became a place for
Yes, but it's a
workers
vacation
who could not
place,
afford
yeah.
a vacation on
Right.
their own to
Right.
come together.
Well, it also was a place where we did training
Yeah,
of
shop
the,
cheerleaders.
of the
Yeah.
But
cheerleaders.
talk
she's
about
talking
integration.
about.
Imagine when
Oh, yeah.
Chinese workers started coming to Unity House
Oh, yeah.
and spending a week with non-Chinese members.
Right.
That's
Right.
hugely important
Yeah.
in how you experience the country.
Thank you so much. And we'll end with just one more question, sort of bringing it up to today. Someone wondering whether there are still many factories and shops in Chinatown.
Almost not at all. I'm sorry to say, and it's very, very sad. I think that 9/11 was kind of the death blow to the industry in Chinatown, as well as heavy real estate speculation, gentrification, development. And so after 9/11, because the whole of Chinatown was in a frozen zone, the work could not come in and out, and the workers even had a hard time coming in and out of the shops because they had, you know, National Guard and, you know, the whole thing stationed. This is the subject of another tenement museum talk that I gave, so people can look that up on YouTube. But unfortunately, there are really just maybe a handful of shops left in Chinatown. The garment district still has been able to preserve sample rooms and more factories, and there had been zoning that the union fought for also back in that day that has protected the building usage for the garment industry. Because the garment industry needs large space, industrial spaces at fairly low rents, and so Chinatown has just skyrocketed way beyond that.
But you know, that's really, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about this. This is why we do things like this. It's a union or an industry which is dying if it's not dead already. But we look at these moments which sort of remind us about the milestones of the union. You can talk about the Triangle Fire, which reminds us all about the tragedy of this union, which gave birth to so many important. And 82 strike was an uplifting moment. It was one of the highest points in the history of a union, which today may be on its way out because the industry on its way out, but it left a long mark on the history of this country.
And this Chinatown
And
community.
Chinatown.
Yeah.
And that your conversation is already impacting our viewers. We had someone share that they weren't aware of social unionism before this talk and are so glad to have learned and are looking forward to learning more. So
good.
you can know that keeping this history alive through conversations like this continues to impact. So I think those are all the questions that we have time for. So back to
Yeah.
May to close us out.
Yeah, so I want to thank everybody, thank our panelists. This was a really interesting and fun conversation.
Thank you, May.
Yeah.
Thank you, May.
And
Thank the
also,
Tenement Museum.
and thank you to the museum, definitely, for this exhibit. If people have not come to visit the Tenement Museum and this factory exhibit, you definitely have to put that on your list of things to do. And in the way of other things to do, there are many commemorative activities being planned for the 1982 strike. There's going to be a big event in Columbus Park on June 25th from 2 to 4 p.m. And there's a very vibrant and informative website on Labor Arts webpage, which I hope people will check out, which keeps a current list of activities, which seems to keep snowballing, as well as beautiful photos and videos and information. So please join us for those activities, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you.